In the history of aerial warfare, there are machines that come off the assembly line ready for glory, and then there are machines like tail number 41 to 2666. By 1943, this specific B-17E Flying Fortress was not a symbol of American air power. It was a joke. It sat at the end of a runway in Port Moresby, New Guinea, baking in the relentless tropical heat. It had been shot up in previous battles, stripped of spare parts, and left to rot in the mud. The ground crews called it Old 666, partly because of its tail number, and partly because they believed it was cursed. It was heavy, it was slow, and it had a reputation for attracting enemy fire like a magnet. No pilot wanted to fly it. No crew wanted to crew it. It was destined for the scrap heap, a metal carcass waiting to be cut apart. But Captain Jay Zeamer was not your average pilot. He was a misfit in the rigid structure of the Army Air Forces. He was a man who didn't care about regulations or standard operating procedures. He cared about survival, and he cared about firepower. Zeamer looked at the rusting hulk of Old 666 and didn't see junk. He saw a canvas. He saw an opportunity to build the deadliest bomber the Pacific Theater had ever seen. He volunteered to take the plane that nobody wanted, and he handpicked a crew of men who, like him, were rebels. They were called the Eager Beavers, a name given with a hint of sarcasm by the other squadrons, but one they would soon turn into a legend written in blood. Zeamer and his crew spent weeks working on the plane. They treated it like a hot rod in a garage. They salvaged guns from wrecked aircraft. They scrounged for ammunition. Standard B-17s were heavily armed, known as flying fortresses for a reason, but Zeamer wanted a battleship. He increased the number of machine guns from the standard 13 to 19. He replaced single guns with twin mounts. He installed waist guns that could fire at sharper angles. But his masterpiece was the nose. In a standard B-17, the pilot has no way to fight back, he just flies the plane while the gunners do the work. Zeamer hated that helpless feeling. He found a fixed .50 caliber machine gun and mounted it directly into the nose, rigged to a trigger on his control column. He had turned a heavy bomber into a massive, 4-engine fighter jet. He could aim the entire plane at the enemy and kill them himself. By June 16, 1943, Old 666 was ready. And it was just in time, because High Command had a mission that was borderline suicidal. They needed a photographic reconnaissance map of Bougainville, an island that was essentially a Japanese fortress. They needed photos of the coastlines to plan an amphibious invasion. The mission required a bomber to fly solo, deep into enemy airspace, and hold a steady, level flight path for 20 minutes to allow the mapping cameras to work. 20 minutes in a straight line, over enemy territory, without fighter escort. It was a mission profile that screamed target practice for the Japanese defenders. Zeamer didn't hesitate. He gathered his crew. "We're going in," he said. "We're getting those pictures." The takeoff was sluggish. Old 666 was heavier than any B-17 should have been, loaded down with extra ammo, extra guns, and the weight of the cameras. It clawed its way into the humid air, the engines screaming under the strain. As they climbed to 25,000 feet, the air grew cold and thin. The crews settled into their positions. Up in the nose was Lieutenant Joe Sarnoski, the bombardier. Sarnoski was Zeamer's best friend. They were inseparable, a duo that functioned with telepathic efficiency. Sarnoski manned the twin guns in the plexiglass nose. He was the tip of the spear. For hours, the flight was tense but uneventful. They crossed the Solomon Sea, the water a deep, indifferent blue below them. As they approached Buka Passage on the northern tip of Bougainville, Sarnoski gave the signal. "Cameras rolling, skipper. Hold her steady." Zeamer gripped the yoke. Holding steady. The plane leveled out. The cameras began to click, capturing the critical intelligence that would save thousands of marine lives in the future. But the clock was ticking. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The Japanese radar on the island was already painting them. On the airfields below, pilots were scrambling to their zeros. At 0800 hours, the silence of the high altitude was shattered. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. The call came from the top turret. Zeamer looked up through the windshield. It wasn't a patrol. It was an extermination squad. High above, glittering like diamonds in the sun, were 5 Japanese S-6M0s. But then, looking down, they saw more rising from the clouds. And more from the flanks. Intelligence had estimated maybe a few fighters. Instead, Old 666 was facing 17 enemy aircraft. The odds were 17-1. The Japanese pilots saw the lone B-17 and moved in for the kill. They were confident. They knew the B-17's weak spots. Their tactic was the head-on pass. They would dive straight at the bomber's nose, firing their 20mm cannons, aiming for the cockpit to kill the pilots. It was a terrifying game of chicken, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. Usually, American bombers would turn away or dive to escape. But Zeamer didn't turn away. He remembered his modifications. He remembered the gun he had bolted to the floor. "Let 'em come," Zeamer yelled over the interphone. He kicked the rudder and hauled the yoke back, turning the nose of Old 666 directly into the path of the lead Zero. He was flying a bomber like a dogfighter. In the nose cone, Joe Sarnoski saw death coming for him. The lead Japanese fighter filled his view, its wings lighting up with muzzle flashes. Sarnoski didn't flinch. He grabbed the handles of his twin .50 calibers and unleashed a stream of lead. The sound was deafening. The nose of the plane filled with smoke and the smell of cordite. Sarnoski's tracers walked right into the engine of the incoming Zero. The Japanese plane disintegrated, turning into a ball of fire that whipped past their wing. Scratch one. But there were too many of them. 4 more Zeros lined up for the same run. They poured fire into the nose of the B-17. The sound of impacts was like hail on a tin roof, but infinitely louder and more violent. Glass shattered. Metal ripped. A 20mm cannon shell smashed through the plexiglass nose and exploded directly in front of Joe Sarnoski. The blast threw him backward into the crawlway. He was grievously wounded, his body riddled with shrapnel, a gaping wound in his side. Simultaneously, another shell tore through the cockpit. It destroyed the oxygen system and smashed into the instrument panel. Metal fragments sliced into Captain Zeamer's legs and arms. His flight suit was instantly soaked in blood. The control column was damaged. The rudder pedals were slick with fluid. The plane lurched violently to the right. In the nose, Sarnoski was bleeding out. He was dying. He knew it. He dragged himself up from the floor, coughing blood. He looked out the shattered nose and saw 2 more Zeros coming in for the finishing blow. They thought the gunner was dead. They thought the plane was defenseless. Sarnoski pulled himself back to his guns. He strapped himself into the seat with fading strength. He wasn't going to die lying down. He racked the charging handles. He waited. In the cockpit, Zeamer, drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss and shock, fought the heavy controls. He couldn't feel his legs. The wind was screaming through the holes in the windshield. He looked over his shoulder. The interior of the plane was a slaughterhouse. But the engines were still turning. The wings were still on. And the Zeros were circling back like sharks that smelled blood in the water. This wasn't a mission anymore. It was a brawl. An Old 666, the scrap heap battleship, was the only thing keeping them from the long fall into the ocean. The fight had just begun. The cockpit of Old 666 was no longer a command center, it was a scene from a horror movie. The wind screamed through the shattered windshield, whipping blood and debris into a vortex. Captain Jay Zeamer sat in a pool of his own blood. The 20mm shell that had exploded near his feet had shredded his legs and smashed the bones in his arms. By all medical logic, he should have been in shock, unconscious, or dead. But adrenaline is a powerful drug, and the instinct to protect his crew was stronger than the pain. He could barely feel the rudder pedals, yet he kept his feet on them, fighting the torque of the engines. He knew that if he passed out, the plane would enter a death spiral from which there would be no recovery. Up in the nose, the situation was even more desperate. Lieutenant Joe Sarnoski was slumped over his guns. The shrapnel wound in his side was catastrophic. He was bleeding out rapidly, his life force draining onto the cold metal floor. But as he looked through the spiderweb cracks of the plexiglass, he saw a Japanese fighter leveling out for another pass. The enemy pilot, seeing the devastation in the nose of the bomber, assumed the gunner was dead. It was a fatal mistake. Sarnoski, summoning the last reserves of his strength, dragged himself back up. He grabbed the handles of the twin-point 50s. His vision was blurring, tunneling into darkness, but he focused on the approaching silhouette. He waited. He let the Zero get close. And then, he squeezed the triggers. The guns roared to life. The Japanese pilot, likely shocked to see the dead bomber fighting back, tried to bank away. It was too late. Sarnoski's aim was true. The stream of heavy-caliber bullets sawed through the Zero's wing root. The fighter snapped in half, tumbling away into the clouds. Sarnoski watched it fall, and then, his strength finally gave out. He collapsed back onto the floor of the nose compartment, his duty done. He had shot down 2 fighters and damaged a third, all while dying. He had bought his friends time. But the battle was far from over. The remaining 15 Zeros were swarming old 666 like angry hornets. They had never seen a B-17 fight like this. Zeamer had turned the lumbering giant into a porcupine of fire. The extra guns he had installed, the waist guns, the radio room gun, the tail guns, were all blazing. The air around the bomber was filled with tracers, a chaotic web of steel. The Japanese pilots tried to attack from the safe angles, the blind spots usually found on a B-17. But on old 666, there were no blind spots. Everywhere they approached, they were met with a wall of lead. Zeamer, fighting through the haze of blood loss, realized they had another problem. The oxygen system had been destroyed in the initial attack. They were at 25,000 feet. Without oxygen, the crew would pass out from hypoxia in minutes. He had to get them down. "We're diving," he rasped over the interphone, his voice weak. He pushed the yoke forward. The B-17 groaned as the nose dropped. They entered a steep, shuddering dive. The airspeed indicator redlined. The airframe rattled violently, rivets threatening to pop. To the Japanese pilots, it looked like the bomber had finally been hit in a vital spot and was falling out of the sky. Some of them peeled off, thinking the kill was confirmed. But old 666 didn't crash. At 10,000 feet, where the air was thick and breathable, Zeamer leveled the plane out. The sudden pull-up exerted immense G-forces on the battered airframe and the wounded men inside. The wings flexed, but they held. Zeamer shook his head, clearing the hypoxia from his brain. He checked the compass. They were still deep in enemy territory, miles from home. And the Zeros, realizing they had been tricked, were coming back. For the next 40 minutes, a running gun battle raged across the skies of the Solomon Sea. It was a marathon of endurance. The gunners inside old 666 were slipping on spent shell casings that carpeted the floor. The barrels of their machine guns were glowing red hot. Sergeant Abel, in the top turret, fired until his hands blistered. The waist gunners, Pugh and Vaughn, swung their weapons from side to side, tracking the fast-moving fighters. The plane was taking hit after hit. The rudder cables were severed. The hydraulic system was shot out. The electrical system was sparking. The fuselage looked like Swiss cheese, riddled with hundreds of bullet holes and cannon rents. Zeamer flew with a kind of delirious precision. Despite his shattered legs, he maneuvered the bomber to give his gunners the best shots. When a Zero attacked from the left, he banked right, exposing the enemy to the dorsal guns. When they attacked from the rear, he yabbed the plane, allowing the waist gunners to open up. He was using the bomber as a weapon itself. The Japanese pilots were relentless, but they were becoming frustrated. They had poured thousands of rounds into this American plane. It was smoking. It was leaking oil. It was flying on 3 engines. But it refused to die. Finally, the impossible happened. The Japanese fighters, low on fuel and ammunition, began to peel away. One by one, they banked toward Bougainville, leaving the battered American bomber alone in the sky. The silence that descended on old 666 was sudden and eerie. The only sound was the drone of the remaining engines and the rushing wind whistling through the countless holes in the fuselage. Zeamer slumped in his seat. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain was returning with a vengeance. He looked down at his legs. The flight suit was heavy with blood. He felt cold, so very cold. "Check in," he whispered into his mask. "Sound off." One by one, the crew replied. They were all wounded. Some minor, some severe. But they were alive. Then, the voice of the navigator, Lieutenant Ruby, came over the line. "Skipper, it's Joe." Zeamer didn't need to hear the rest. He knew. Lieutenant Joe Sarnoski, the man who had volunteered for this mission just to keep his friends safe, the man who had manned the guns while bleeding to death, was gone. He had died at his post, defending the ship. A heavy sorrow settled over the cockpit, heavier than the damaged aircraft itself. But Zeamer couldn't mourn yet. He couldn't let go. They were still hundreds of miles from Port Moresby. The plane was a wreck. The hydraulics were gone, which meant no brakes and no flaps for landing. And the pilot was bleeding to death. Zeamer turned the broken nose of old 666 toward New Guinea. He forced his eyes to stay open. He focused on the horizon. He had to get them home. He had to get the photos back. He had to make sure Joe's sacrifice wasn't for nothing. The return flight would be the longest journey of his life, a battle not against the Japanese, but against death itself, creeping up his numb limbs. The legend of old 666 had been written in the sky, but the final chapter would be decided on the runway. The return flight of old 666 was a quiet agony. For nearly 3 hours, the battered bomber limped across the Solomon Sea, dragging its wounded metal carcass through the sky. The adrenaline that had sustained the crew during the dogfight had evaporated, replaced by the dull, throbbing reality of their injuries. The interior of the plane smelled of sulfur, hydraulic fluid, and the copper tang of drying blood. In the cockpit, Captain Jay Zeamer was fading. The loss of blood from his shredded legs and arms was catastrophic. His vision tunneled, the horizon blurring into a gray smudge. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to close his eyes, to let go, to sleep. But he knew that sleep meant death. Not just for him, but for the men in the back who were bandaging each other's wounds. Co-pilot Hans Stone offered to take the controls, but Zeamer refused. He needed to feel the vibration of the yoke to stay tethered to reality. He flew by instinct, guiding the plane over the treacherous Owen Stanley Mountains, the jagged peaks reaching up like fingers trying to drag them down. As the coastline of New Guinea finally appeared in the distance, a new problem emerged. Port Moresby came into view, shimmering in the heat. Zeamer keyed the radio. His voice was a whisper, barely audible over the static. "Tower, this is 666. Coming in hot." The tower controllers grabbed their binoculars. What they saw approaching the airfield didn't look like a plane. It looked like a flying wreck. The stabilizer was shot to pieces. The nose was smashed open. Smoke was trailing from the engines. "Prepare for crash landing," Zeamer rasped. This was the moment of truth. The hydraulic lines had been severed hours ago. This meant the landing gear had to be cranked down manually by the exhausted crew. It also meant there were no wing flaps to slow the plane down, and most terrifyingly, no brakes. They would be hitting the runway fast, and they would have no way to stop. The wheels touched the dirt strip with a jarring thud. The B-17 screamed down the runway, kicking up a massive cloud of red dust. It was coming in too hot. The end of the runway was approaching rapidly, and beyond it, the jungle and a steep drop-off. Zeamer, summoning the very last spark of his strength, did the only thing he could. He ground-looped the plane. He slammed the rudder and cut the engines, forcing the massive bomber to spin violently. The tires screeched, the metal groaned, and the world outside the cockpit became a blur of spinning earth and sky. Then, silence. Old 666 came to a halt in a cloud of dust, just feet from the tree line. The props spun down. The engines ticked and cooled. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, the silence was broken by the sound of sirens. Ambulances and jeeps raced across the tarmac. Ground crews sprinted toward the plane, fire extinguishers in hand. When they reached the aircraft, they stopped dead in their tracks. They stared in disbelief. The plane was a sieve. Later, they would count the damage. There were 187 bullet holes in the fuselage. There were 5 huge rents from 20mm cannon shells. The rudder was hanging by a thread. It was structurally impossible that this machine had stayed in the air. It was a miracle of engineering and stubborn will. The medics pried open the hatches. They gently lifted the crew out one by one. When they reached the nose compartment, they found Lieutenant Joe Sarnoski. He was still at his post, slumped over the guns that had saved them all. He had died protecting his ship. They covered him with a blanket, a solemn procession moving through the dust. Then they got to the cockpit. They found Zeamer unconscious, his hands still locked around the yoke in a death grip. They had to pry his fingers loose. He looked like a corpse, pale, blood-soaked, barely breathing. The flight surgeon took one look at him and shook his head. "Get him to surgery, now. I don't know how this man is alive." For 3 days, Jay Zeamer hovered in the twilight between life and death. He received 4 blood transfusions. They picked over 100 pieces of shrapnel out of his body. But Zeamer was as stubborn in a hospital bed as he was in a cockpit. He refused to die. When he finally woke up, his first question wasn't about his legs or his medals. It was about the mission. Did the pictures come out? They did. The film canisters from the cameras in the belly of old 666 were developed. The photos were perfect. They showed the Japanese defenses on Bougainville in crystal clear detail. Intelligence officers used those photos to map the beaches, locate gun emplacements, and plan the amphibious assault. Because of the suicide mission flown by the Eager Beavers, the invasion of Bougainville was a success. Thousands of Marines landed on those beaches and survived because they knew exactly where the enemy was waiting. The story of old 666 reached the highest levels of the military. It was a story that defined the spirit of the Army Air Forces. For their heroism that day, the crew became the most decorated in United States history. Every man on board received a medal. But the highest honors were reserved for the pilot and the bombardier. Captain Jay Zeamer and Lieutenant Joe Sarnoski were both awarded the Medal of Honor. It was the only time in World War II that 2 members of the same crew were awarded the nation's highest honor for the same mission. Sarnoski's medal was presented to his grieving widow. Zeamer received his in the hospital, presented by General Kenny himself. Jay Zeamer eventually recovered, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He returned to the United States a hero, but a quiet one. He rarely spoke of the battle. He lived a long life, passing away in 2007 at the age of 88, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient of the Army Air Forces. As for old 666, the cursed plane? It never flew combat again. It had given everything it had. It was too damaged to be repaired, its structural ribs shattered, its skin flayed. It was eventually scrapped, returned to the pile of metal from which Zeamer had saved it. But its legacy was not in the aluminum. It was in the impossible survival of the men who flew it. The story of old 666 is more than just a war story. It is a testament to the idea that there is no such thing as a lost cause. A scrapped plane, a misfit crew, a suicide mission. By all metrics, they should have failed. They should have been a brief footnote in a casualty report. Instead, they flew into the mouth of hell, looked 17 death machines in the eye, and spat fire. They proved that it's not the machine that makes the legend. It's the men inside.